Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining promptly. It's nice to see you all. So while we're giving folks another 30 seconds or so, would love to have you start putting in the chat a little bit about you. So who you are, where you're calling in from, and I would love some book recommendations. I am looking for my next summer read. I just finished another behavioral science book called A Little More Social, which is about reaching out to people and being more chatty. But if you have any good summer reads, please share while we're having people arrive. Mercedes, so glad you're still enjoying the MAPS book list. What are you on right now? Flourish. Ah, that was on my reading list, so I will check it out. Welcome, folks who just arrived. We're just introducing ourselves briefly and sharing book recommendations because we are peak summer and I'm starting to get well through my list and need some more ideas. Nudge, of course. Love it. That's great, Mercedes. Amazing. So we're going to get started because we only have a short time together. But thank you for joining. We're going to talk about influence at the front line. So whether you are someone who is a sales rep or a medical science liaison in or outside of healthcare, whether you work with those teams, manage those teams, create communications for teams who talk to customers or patients or healthcare providers, this will be relevant to you. So I want to start with a story first to kind of set up some of the ideas we're going to revisit later in today's talk. And this is a story about some research that was done in the 60s that has since been replicated many times over about how do we get people to do something we're trying to get them to do. In this case, it was a story about getting students to get vaccinated, their flu vaccine in the fall. And they tried a few different approaches to figure out what's actually going to move people to take this action. In one approach, they simply made the case. They used all their great persuasive techniques, maybe some fear-based messaging, but not too much, making it personalized, connecting with the person in front of them individually to try to just persuade them with their words. And they found in that case that about 3% of the students followed through on getting their flu vaccine. So better than nothing, but not huge. In the other condition, they said, look, let's not deal with the touchy-feely stuff. Let's just make it easy, right? That's one of our classic behavioral science principles is make it easy. So we're going to give them a map of campus. We're going to put a big circle around where the student health clinic is. We're going to have them make a plan for what time on what day after which class, what route through campus are you going to take to walk there? And they made that, which is called implementation intentions. That got 0% conversion rate on the flu vaccines. So we know from behavioral science that making it easy is important, but if you haven't engaged with someone and made the case as well, you are not going to get very far. In the last condition, they gave both, they did both. So they made the case and they helped them make their plan. And that got a 28% follow through rate. So this is something that I want us to hold in our minds throughout today's conversation about how we actually move people effectively. It's both making the case and making it easy. So just to introduce myself to anyone who we haven't met yet, I'm Suzanne Kirkendall. I'm the founder and CEO of Verelon, which is a consultancy dedicated to bringing more behavioral science to the business world in a very practical way. I have trained everyone from call center patient educators to financial advisors working with high net worth clients to public health frontline staff on how to be more effective in engaging with the people that they are trying to persuade. So I'm excited to share some of those stories with you later today. Outside of training and consulting, I guest lecture at universities about behavioral science. I write peer-reviewed and industry articles very regularly, and I also get to advise a few startups, which is a lot of fun. I was previously the CEO of North America at BVA Nudge Consulting, which is a global behavioral science consulting company acquired by Ipsos, and co-founded the social science division at McCann Health, which is a very large pharma marketing agency. So worked with a lot of stakeholders over a long period of time on this, and I'm really excited to share some of the top takeaways for you. But why are you here? You're here because you want to learn, and you want to learn some specific things. So you all very kindly filled out the registration form with what you were most excited to take away, and there were a few themes that rose to the top. So one was the idea of how do I effortlessly steer a conversation? Related to that, there were a lot of questions around how do I ask better questions to understand the person in front of me and actually connect with them instead of just saying my spiel. We also want to talk about how do we add these skills to our seller's toolkit in a repeatable way. So we don't want to just kind of know it, we want to do it and we want it done consistently. And then, of course, I'd had a lot of fun questions about uses of behavioral science in the real world. And that's really important to me at Verelon is making this real and practical, not theoretical. So we will have some case studies for you at the end. But the big theme overall I'm hearing is methodology, which is great because I have some really solid techniques to share with you. And at the end, for those who stay, I have a gift for you in the form of a PDF that will have a summary and a worksheet that's not presented here today for you to put this into practice in an even more easy way. So stick around to the end. I would love to drop that into the chat for you for those who attended live to say thank you. So what we're going to talk about the next 25 minutes or so is a very brief behavioral science primer so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about when we're talking about behavioral science. Then we'll talk about why influence is hard. This is not something that is easy, right? That's why we're here learning how to do it better. So we'll break down from the behavioral science perspective some of the challenges that we often face. Then we'll talk about influence principles, of course. We'll talk about making it stick. So how do you train this with folks? Not just teach them, but get them to actually do it going forward. And then, of course, I have some case studies to share. If you have questions throughout, pop them in the chat. We will try to get to them. If not, I will definitely follow up with you afterwards. So, behavioral science primer. Quick question for you, speaking of the chat. Can you just drop a 1 or a 2 or a 3 to let me know your familiarity level with behavioral science? 1 being it's really new to you and you're just starting to learn. 2, you've dabbled, you've got a lot of reading under your belt, you've maybe even practiced a little bit. Or 3, you're very familiar. Love to just take the temperature. 2.5, I like it. 3, good, own it. You're allowed to say 1, by the way. Most people are a 1. Nice, we've got a good range here. Well, you're all in the right place. We're going to talk about the basics, make sure we're all using the same language, and then we're going to talk about how do we apply it in a practical way. So, behavioral science definition. So we have this shared language. It's an umbrella term that refers to all the fields that help us to understand why people do what they do and then to guide their behavior for the better. So that's social science, that's health psychology, that's behavioral economics, sociology, anthropology, neuroscience, all of those things brought together into the applied real world space. We do this because it gives us a really powerful toolkit to create new experiences, new messages, new systems, new environments, new processes that help make the right behavior almost inevitable. And it's important to take this behavioral science lens because we are a lot less rational than we might think. Our human brains have a lot going on under the surface that we are not conscious of. And the reason for that is very adaptive because a lot of our way of navigating the world is on autopilot so that we don't use up all our cognitive effort just processing all the stimuli that's coming at us at every moment. However, when we put a lot of things on autopilot, that means we have a lot less awareness of what actually drives us. So we need a different lens to understand ourselves and others. So specifically, we're very biased. By biased, I'm talking about cognitive biases, which are the subconscious mental shortcuts that drive that autopilot navigation of the world. We are contextual. So the way that information is presented to us changes how we receive it. So if I say to you, this has a 90% survival rate, or if I say to you, this has a 10% mortality rate, mathematically, those are the same thing, and it shouldn't matter which way I say that, but in fact, it has a huge impact on the way that you receive that information, right? So we're not as rational as we think if something like that simple framing makes a difference. We're also very social. We are pack animals, so we really care about what other people think of us, and we really like to follow the crowd. And we are emotional. This is something that is really easy to forget or think of as a nice to have or an extra, but is actually fundamental to decision making and behavior change. There are lots of interesting studies that show that when people's emotional part of their brain is damaged through illness or injury, they actually cannot make decisions. They can't get dressed in the morning because there's a lot of decision making that happens in our life that you can't calculate a black and white answer to. Like, should I wear a white shirt or a blue shirt today? And it's also motivating, right? It gives us the oomph to actually make the effort to make the decision and follow through on it. So when we know this about ourselves and others, we approach understanding them and influencing them in a completely different way. Because traditionally, a lot of times when we're thinking about influence and sales and educating our customer, we're picking our targets based on different data and segmentation. We're sharpening our messaging based on some customer feedback where they tell us what they think consciously. And then we assume that the facts that we're giving them are going to change behavior. We throw more data at them, more statistics, more persuasive stories. That's going to be sufficient. And all of that is really treating the audience as this imaginary rational character that's not how people work. Instead, when we use a behavioral science lens for this, we diagnose first why people are doing and deciding the way that they do with a completely different lens, and I'll explain how in a little bit. And then we use a different toolkit to figure out what's going to change their behavior. So we're designing for actual barriers, not the ones that we think are happening, and it's much more human first. And in the case studies I'll share later, you'll see how that gets you really, really strong results in the business world. But let's first talk about some of the interesting behavioral science reasons why influence is hard. We've all experienced it being difficult to persuade someone, whether it's a customer or a friend or a teenager. But there are some interesting specific models that we can keep in mind. And one of the big ones is this. We have a broken assumption about how we change behavior. Most people think that the way that people work is they get information, they take that information in, they process it somehow in a way that makes sense, to then form an attitude or a belief or a feeling or an intention that is in line with whatever that information was, and then follow through with some kind of behavior that makes sense based on that attitude that is aligned with that information that they originally received. That is how robots work. That is how maybe Spock works. But that is not how humans work. So this actually breaks down at both points. It breaks down at this first point where you go from information and attitude to get to attitude, sometimes, not always, a lot of times because of identity. I think this is a really interesting one for this use case of selling and persuading our customers. Identity is going to trump evidence every single time. So if you're talking to a doctor about the latest data and the new study results that have come out, and it's so amazing, if they identify as, I am someone who's a conservative prescriber, I never prescribe anything too early when it's new, you're not going to persuade them with more and more evidence. In fact, you're going to show them that you don't understand them by fighting against that identity. So you need a different approach, which we'll talk about later. When we're talking about, okay, maybe they have the information, maybe they even have the attitude, the intention, the belief, but they might not get to the actual behavior. We've all done this with our New Year's resolutions, right? We mean well, but we don't actually do the thing. It's because inaction is the easiest thing. We are optimized to reduce and conserve effort. That's decision-making and that's action effort. So even if it's for the better, even if we want to do it, it is hard to do something different than whatever the status quo is. We like to go with the flow. So inaction is always easier. There's another feature of this called omission bias, where we feel less responsible for an outcome if it happened because we didn't do anything than if we did something. This is the philosophical trolley problem. So we are also more risk averse when it comes to making a change than just letting the status quo continue. So there's a lot in the way there. Another thing is, even if someone agrees and they say, yes, I want this thing that you are asking me to do, that doesn't mean they're actually going to do it, right? You can have information, you can have the attitude, and you can still not have the behavior because of something called the intention action gap or the say do gap. You could really mean it and still not do it. And so we need to help people with what's called that last mile. And if you think back to the story at the beginning, that's a little bit of a hint about why having both the case and the plan made the difference. So that's customers. That's what's getting in the way for them in many cases. Then we think about the reps. It's really hard for them to improve for a lot of reasons, right? You could have a really pleasant conversation with a patient, an HCP, a potential customer, and think that that was progress. But pleasant conversations are nice for relationships. It doesn't mean they're moving anyone's behavior, but it's hard to know how that's going to go because it's so decoupled from the ultimate outcome. Another thing that I see a lot, that I work with folks a lot on, is something called the curse of knowledge, where your rep, your educator, your salesperson, they have so much expertise and they have had the same conversation and made the same pitch 100 times, right? And so for them, it feels really fluent and clear because they're so used to talking about it, they've forgotten what it feels like for it to be new information to someone. So they walk away thinking, that was great. I really nailed that. And the person on the other end could have been completely overwhelmed and not following at all. And they would have a complete disconnect in that experience because of the curse of knowledge. And kind of bringing all of this together is the idea that you don't really get a feedback loop. Very rarely is the person you're speaking to in the moment going to give you the feedback that they're not following you at all, or they're really not liking that thing that you just said, or it didn't make any sense, or could you phrase it a different way? Most people are not going to give you that kind of feedback in the moment. Maybe someone says something in customer satisfaction survey, which you get weeks, months later, usually in aggregation. You have no way of connecting it with that moment that you had that conversation with that person or said something that way. And then, of course, with actual sales, prescriptions, referrals, whatever the actual behavior is you wanted from your customer, that comes much later as well. So when you don't have a feedback loop, it's very hard to change your behavior in any accurate way. So it's understandable why this is difficult for a lot of different reasons. However, there is good news. There is a lot that we can do about it. So let's talk about some influence principles through this behavioral science lens. So these are the three buckets of principles that I'm going to give you. This is the one big slide that I would like you to remember of thinking about. We want to diagnose accurately with that new lens, understanding that people are not rational and we have subconscious things driving us and lots of other contextual things going on that affect our behaviors. The way that we frame it, this is the make the case part of the vaccination story. And the way we make it easy, that's the make the plan part of the vaccination story. This is the key slide. And on the takeaway that I will give you at the end, all of this will be summarized for you. So let's talk about diagnosis. A lot of you asked about how do I ask better questions to understand the person in front of me? So one trick that I use when I'm doing any kind of research, any kind of interviewing, any kind of customer conversation is specificity. So instead of asking, why aren't you using it for your patients, or why are you using it for your patients? Ask about the last time. Ask about a specific patient. Why didn't you use it for that patient on Tuesday? Why wouldn't you use it for a patient of this very specific description? Then give them room to talk. We are really uncomfortable with silence in general as a culture, and so we rush to fill it in. So they'll give us one kind of surface level answer usually, and then we start talking again. If you just leave a couple seconds pause, they will also get uncomfortable and they will fill that pause with more information, which is what you want. So sometimes the answer to asking better questions is actually just leaving room for them to talk. So we want specificity, we want to leave space. Then, I know when it comes to any kind of frontline training, we're always talking about objection handling. And there are lots and lots of different ways to do this, but a couple of things I would add as really important and valuable are maybe don't handle the objection the way that you might by pushing back or giving more evidence. Instead, say, okay, you're saying cost is a real barrier. What else is in the way? Don't argue with the first thing because it's usually going to be kind of a throwaway thing. Get underneath, right? And don't push back. Ask what else. You'll get something more interesting on that second answer. Another thing that you can do, depending on the context, is ask what else, what would have to be true? Say, okay, I hear your objection. Accept it. I'm not going to push back and argue with you. Instead, say, okay, fine. What would have to be different for this to be true? And that actually starts to get them to make the case for you, which is really helpful, obviously, for a lot of different reasons. And then the last thing that it's really easy to forget is remembering that they are not making a decision in a vacuum. So the person in front of you, their decision to say yes and actually do the thing you're asking them to do, it's going to affect perhaps the office staff who's going to have to do more paperwork or prior authorizations because they've decided to prescribe that thing. It's going to affect someone else's, budget approval process. It's going to affect their wife who needs to also agree, right? Whoever else is in that person's orbit related to this decision is going to be in their mind when they are talking to you, but they might not say it out loud. So getting clear on who else needs to say yes besides the person in front of you will help you have a more effective conversation. So we want to diagnose for the actual barriers. Once we've done that, we can then frame and make our case more effectively. So narratives are always more effective than statistics. Human brains are very, very bad at numbers, even if they're the most amazing data and stats in the world. A story of a single person with that pulls at your heartstrings is always going to be more effective. So even if you're presenting something really dry and data heavy, find a narrative for it. It's going to land a lot better. Social norms, classic for a reason because they work. So we don't need to do the cheesy 9 out of 10 doctors recommend, but finding something specific and true. Like I talk to a lot of other doctors in settings like yours, and they do this. Or I talk to a lot of other people who are facing that same challenge and they've approached it this way. Make it specific to that person in front of you, and you are going to be more persuasive. And then we're going back to identity. We talked about it earlier as being something important that you cannot argue with and shouldn't try to argue with, but instead work with it. Say, yes, you are a really careful prescriber. Totally agree. Let's talk more about that instead of arguing against it, right? And what you can move is not identity, but you can move what counts as being consistent with that identity. And so that becomes the framing exercise of saying, yes, doing this is actually consistent with being a careful prescriber or a conservative budgeter or whoever it is you're speaking with, right? So that's the frame that starts to get really interesting in these conversations. And then finally, make it easy. All my 2s and 3s, you know the behavioral science classic phrasing, make it easy. This is really important. This was the make a plan part of the story at the beginning. So one thing to make it easy during conversation is a technique called signposting. So this is where you tell them what you're going to tell them before you tell them. It's a classic teaching technique. It's really important, especially if you're doing something a little bit more educational or dense. But this is something that's so easy to forget because of that curse of knowledge we talked about. You know it, it's so clear and easy to you. You know exactly all the points you're hitting, and it seems really fluent when you are saying it. But to someone else on the other side, where this is the first time they're encountering this information, it's really hard to follow if you don't give them a mental framework. So tell them, I'm going to share the product features, some data about it, some testimonials, and then would love to talk about it and answer any of your questions. So now they have a framework and a bucket to put the information in. They're going to hold a lot more of that. Defaults and removing friction. So every extra form, click, email that someone has to do to go through with the behavior you're asking them to do is a chance for them to drop off. So think about how much of that you can take off of their desk and make it your task. You're going to get more people following through. And then, as we talked about with the vaccination plan story, not just saying, yes, I'm planning to get vaccinated next week, but saying, I'm going to walk this path from this class at this time on this day. That is when people start to actually follow through. So in the same way, think about what is the very specific action I'm asking this person to do as a next step, not a general. So that's what we'd like to do. How do we train this so it sticks? Because we've all sat through trainings where we say, yep, makes sense, I've tried it, and then we all go back to our usual way of doing things. So how do we do it differently so that it works? Obviously, this is a whole session on itself to go into a lot of depth about how to train effectively, but a few tips here for you. One is your best reps aren't going to be able to tell you what they're doing that actually works in most cases. So instead of asking them, just listen to calls. Observed behavior is always more accurate than reported behavior because of the reasons we talked about earlier about people being not conscious of what drives them and having very different perceptions of the same experience. So wherever you can, if you're trying to improve, give feedback, work on what's working and amplify it, observe, don't ask. Similar to the idea that a great conversation with a client seems like progress, but isn't necessarily, a really well-received workshop is great. We want positive feelings about it, but that doesn't mean it's going to change behavior. So don't just rely on, smiley face feedback frameworks to see if that was a good training. You really need to look at the behavior that changes and make sure you've set up a plan to measure that before you've even done the training. Classic teaching techniques. Yes, we want repetition, but retrieval is better than repetition because retrieval, meaning I actually pull this thought or idea or action out of my brain and do it in the moment I need to do it, is what we're training for. We want people to enact these in real life. So role play, everyone hates it at the beginning, but comes out smiling, and that's how they actually retain and practice and build these skills. The more you can do it, the better at the original training, but also over time to reinforce. And then spaced reinforcement is how we actually learn. I never ever recommend to anyone to do one-off training and never talk about it again and assume it's going to change. It will not. You will go back to the way that you were doing things before. So think about what is the spacing mechanism we're going to use to reinforce this over time. And in the case study I'm about to share, I'll show you how some teams have done this. Think about the messenger, not just the material. So find a champion on the team who can be a peer, who wants to take this on to help co-lead. That is how you're going to get much higher take up than if it's something that's top down. And then, as with our customers, we want to think about changing our reps' behavior in the same way, attached to existing habits and be specific. Which call, which technique, when exactly are you going to start to put this into practice? Case studies. So, first one I want to share is a healthcare case study. The second one I have is in the financial services, just so you can see a variety of contexts. So, this was work done with patient educators in a contact center. They were highly educated nurses who were not selling per se, but were trying to keep patients going through the funnel if they were eligible. And this was for a medical device. So, they wanted patients to stay in and they wanted them to talk to their doctor about it. They found that they were having those warm conversations, thinking it was very effective, and then patients were going away and never talking to them again and not really following through at the rate one would expect, given they were eligible. So what I did was first, of course, listen to the calls. Don't ask them about the calls, listen to the calls, and look to the call guide to see how those things are aligning. Then, based on all the findings from that audit, created a training that had just 5 simple behavioral science techniques for them to use on every single call. One of them was signposting, for example. Another one was a simple way of ending the calls to make sure that there was a next step of another call or an emailed brochure or anything to just keep them going and not just say, thanks, have a nice day. And specifically not asking them, can I call you, but telling them, I will call you again, right? So we're taking some of the decision off of their plate. Then the reinforcement. So the team elected a nudge queen who was their internal champion. And at each of their weekly team meetings, it was her job to lead the discussion on one of those 5 techniques. How did it go? What did we learn? What are we going to do differently this week? And they did that for months. We then listened to the call recordings again at 3 months post-training and 18 months post-training and did a refresher training at that point because the team had doubled. And we found that 5 out of 5 behavioral science principles were used more and more at each of those 2 points. So they were getting better the further out they were from training, which was amazing. And 92% of patients reported in surveys that they were likely or very likely to ask their doctor about the device. And importantly, they were 3 times more likely to actually receive that device. So not just stated, but actual behavior. I know we're down to the last minute or so, so I'll just gloss over the financial services case, but this was training financial advisors to speak more effectively with high net worth clients, moving from a transactional to a relational approach with some specific techniques based on personas that were created of those clients. They were able to reinforce those on monthly calls and compare the results of the group who went through the training with the group who did not. And they found that 100% of those advisors would recommend the training, which they had never seen before, which was wonderful. But importantly, the clients who were the part of the advisors who went through the training had a 15% increase in their invested assets. So if you think about the return on investment on that, incredible. Very excited for them. So we're right on time. We've covered the behavioral science primer, why influence is hard, some principles you can use, making it stick, and some case studies. For those who attended, I will drop that PDF in the chat that I promised. Thank you so much for showing up live and spending your lunchtime with me. I really am glad you're here. If you want help putting this into practice with the diagnosis or the training, of course, get in touch. We'd love to chat with you about how we might be able to help. But otherwise, I want to say thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'm here for a few more minutes if anyone does have a question, but I also know we're right at time.
This is so helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Could figure out how to bring you to our company. This would be so impactful. So many ways that we can help out. So thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Great to hear it was helpful.